Railway Conversations with Doc Frank.
Hey, I'm Doc Frank. Welcome to my podcast where every week I'm presenting you authentic, spontaneous and unrehearsed discussions with interesting guests from the rail industry about topics that matter. Make sure you subscribe and tell your friends about it, as this podcast will both educate and entertain them. Thank you for listening. Hi, this is Doc Frank. Let me jump in here right now to tell you about a new training which is called High Capacity Signaling Blueprint. This is a very unique all-in-one training that gives you everything you need to know about high capacity signaling. The foundations where you can compare what conventional signaling is to what high capacity signaling is with all the necessary definitions. Then we look at CBTC, communications-based train control, as the prime technology for high capacity signaling and how this is done. In the third part of the training, we look at varieties of the European Train Control System, ETCS, another global train control technology, and how this can be used to achieve high-capacity signaling. And then at the end of the training comes an actual blueprint how to apply CBTC or ETCS to get a real high-capacity outcome for your railway. It's basically 3 training courses in one. And as usual for my trainings, there is a study group available for joint learning with other people taking the same training. And after the training, you will get into an alumni community, which is exclusive for my training students, where you can ask questions and get them answered by myself on an ongoing basis for a guaranteed minimum of 12 months. You can sign up on my usual training platform, which is docfranktraining.podia.com/HCS Blueprint. I said it again, docfranktraining.podia.com/HCS Blueprint, with HCS being the acronym for High Capacity Signaling. If it's important for you to learn about the latest trend in railway signaling, which is high capacity signaling, then this is the training for you. Dr. Chris Hale, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Good to be able to talk about rail with you today.
We had a good interview on that podcast recently with a transport planner in the rail space, and you are a transport planner as well. So I'm hoping that this one will be at least as interesting as the other one, hopefully more. There's a lot of things going on in Australia at the moment with regards to rail infrastructure, and a lot of those things seem to be new to the country. For example, Sydney building a first metro system. Melbourne in the future doing something similar with the suburban rail loop. Some of the railways in Australia and the cities increasing the available capacity, which changes the entire operation towards a more metro style transport system. For things that are new to Australia, how important do you think is international perspective, and how much can you bring to the table as a transport planner?
Yeah, I think the international perspective is absolutely vital, because I think what's really happened in Australia is over the last, let's call it 10 years, there's been an increase in the appetite at state government level in Australia to invest in rail. But if we went back 15 years ago, certainly, and 20 years ago and beyond, there was a massive gap, and let's call it about 40 years since the Melbourne Loop opened. I think that was early 1980s or something like that, and presumably the project was underway for about 4 or 5 or 6 years to open in the 1980s. But at the same time in the 1980s and the 1990s, I think internationally, maybe not in the United States, but elsewhere in Europe and in East Asia and so on, it was a very strong period for rail investment. Whether we talk about somewhere like Singapore really emerging as a major rail city, and with rail investment being part of their economic development program there in Singapore, and I'm talking about the 1980s, really. Same thing in Hong Kong, and my experience in spending time in Germany and France, for example, is that they spent put a lot of investment into rail in particular. And again, I'm talking about during the 1980s and through into the 1990s with very consistent investment programs to have the fully developed rail systems that you now see in German or French cities, essentially. And the Australians like to treat rail as if it's a sort of a legacy thing, because it is in Australia. The rail systems that we have today in Australia are mainly a legacy of, investments that were made 100 years ago, basically. And so Australians are very reluctant to face up to this idea that while we were standing still during the 1980s and the 1990s and really being very, very sceptical about investment in rail, elsewhere in the world, rail investment was basically a centrepiece of city development, of urban planning, even of high-level strategic policy. So I think it's absolutely vital that we reflect on that history and maybe some other aspects of more recent history, in, for example, in Southeast Asia and China, which we might get time to speak about in a moment. I think all of those aspects of the history of rail over the last 40 years are crucial to recognise for understanding where we're at in Australia at this time.
It's interesting you say that, because I've been doing a lot of research recently on the whole topic of mindset when transforming railway organizations. And what I find is that people are often trapped in this old, what I call legacy mindset, where they treat a new system or they look at a new system in a very similar way as the old one. So, for example, I could imagine that there are still a lot of people in Sydney that consider Sydney Metro as a kind of extension of the Sydney Trains network, rather than a completely different transport mode, which actually it is. I mean, there are some similarities, obviously, the rails where the trains are running on, but other than that, operationally, Metro is a very different beast than a normal conventional railway system. And the railways in the cities that transform their railways with higher capacity and want to really get higher capacity out of the system, they also need to change their operations towards a more Metro-style service. And I think this is where a lot of people are getting trapped in what has worked for them for the last, 20, 30 years of their careers.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that's a fantastic topic for Australians to spend more time reflecting on. I guess the way I would describe it is I'm spend a lot of time researching and spending time in Germany in particular. And what I like about Germany is the idea of different tiers of rail, or tiers of public transport, really. But you have in Germany a really good differentiation between what they call the U-Bahn, which is basically different styles of U-Bahn in different cities, but it's basically a metro style concept mainly. And that's differentiated with the S-Bahn, which is basically a suburban rail. But the S-Bahn, I think, is very interesting because it has very standardized features, both in terms of service patterns, rolling stock, et cetera, et cetera. So you go to different cities around Germany and the S-Bahn offering looks very similar in different cities. And it's again, crucially important to recognise that that's deliberately different from a U-Bahn, which is a more of an urban core metro style offering, and also different again to regional rail in Germany, and also obviously to high-speed rail, for example. Whereas in Australia, we don't. When people talk about rail, I found in recent years, I agree with some of what you're saying. So there's a tendency to default towards the existing legacy rail systems that we have and to make assumptions on that basis. But then also I think there's another trap, which is to assume that everything that's not the legacy system must be this new thing called Metro. But we don't, in Australia, we haven't really developed a standardised sensibility about what our version of Metro is. And I think that's a problem for us as well, so that we could lose track, even for argument's sake, of some of the benefits and inherent features of our existing legacy rail systems. For example, the Sydney system is a very, very unique system on a world basis with very particular attributes. It's got very large vehicles, very large rolling stock. It takes people over relatively long distances in terms of the trips that they're travelling. It's very much a metropolitan sort of coverage, strategic metropolitan version of rail. And I think it requires its own reinvestment program and so on. And it's very good to differentiate that to something new, which is metro. But what I've been a little bit surprised about up there in Sydney is how I think people sometimes lose track of some of the benefits of their existing and inherent attributes of their existing network, and somehow sort of seeing metro as a catch-all. Everything's metro, and the same sort of thing in Melbourne. Everything's a metro style. The famous 2012 PTV network development plan from some people might remember back here in from whatever that was, 10 or 11 years ago in Victoria. Everything that wasn't legacy, everything about the future of rail was apparently going to be metro this, metro that, a metro style rail system. And again, I'd like to go back to the idea that a detailed knowledge of international rail helps us to clearly distinguish between different tasks that our rail should be servicing, therefore different systems, different service patterns, et cetera, and I don't believe we've developed that sensibility yet, or that strategic direction here in Australia.
What I think, I mean, I've seen both the term tier between different modes of public transport seen in strategic planning documents, both in Sydney and in Melbourne. And but what I think happens is that it's one thing to write it down on paper. It's another thing to implement it in the daily thinking. And Melbourne, you mentioned the network development plan, which I studied back in the day quite a bit, and I thought it was a really, really good document. Which also explained what they meant by a metro style network. So they didn't just throw around with the term, but they actually defined the characteristics of a metro style railway system. The problem was they didn't implement it like this. Maybe because they found out they couldn't afford it or didn't want to afford it. For example, the notion of standalone lines, which then has the consequence that every line requires its own captive train fleet, which also means every line requires its own depot for trains and its own maintenance facilities for trains. And I think that was the point where the government in Victoria just ended up saying, I don't want to spend the money for this. I want to build a suburban rail loop. I want to build a railway line to the airport. I want to build a faster service to Geelong. I want to do all of those things. And I mean, two of the three that I just mentioned are currently on hold because of affordability, I guess. So this concept of creating a metro style network was good in theory. It would have been feasible if it was implemented, but it wasn't. And on top of that, I think there is still an issue with the terminology in Melbourne, where the current operator calls themselves Metro Trains Melbourne, and the network is called the Metropolitan Network. So I'm not sure whether many people can really differentiate between Metropolitan and Metro, between Metro Trains Melbourne and the real metro system, such as, I don't know, Sydney or even more so Singapore, Hong Kong, something like that. So I believe there's a lot of confusion going on, which is not helping really with strategic planning.
Yeah, I think there's a few different interesting things that you said there. Firstly, I agree with one of the risks right now is that the network development plan here in Melbourne from back in 2012 had a lot of work items that looked like, things that are going to happen between 10 years and 20 years from the original date of 2012. And now I think we're entering into a risky period where a lot of stuff that was nice and comfortable to say, and we're going to do this in 10 years or 12 or 15 or 17 years. Now we're into that exact period where a lot of those work items are theoretically meant to be delivered. And if they were delivered on that original conceptualization and time horizon, I think the Melbourne Metropolitan Rail Network would be moving in a very, very good, positive direction. Where I maybe see it a little bit different to what you suggested before, I think actually there was, although I think in terms of what you're just saying at the end there, I think there is a problematic overemphasis or overuse of the word metro, particularly in the Melbourne context. And in that would have been my main criticism of the 2012 Network Development Plan, that it overused both the terminology of metro, and it kind of fudged the issue of what a metro-style rail service actually is, i.e. Singapore, Hong Kong, maybe even Paris, for argument's sake. And it fudged the issue of why a Paris-style, Singapore-style rail offering, firstly, is simply not what we have on a metropolitan scale in Melbourne or in Sydney or in Brisbane. We have a different style of rail. Again, it covers longer distances. It's more about that metropolitan coverage. It really is more about strategically getting people around from out from the suburbs into the central business district and so on. But that's okay. So I think that would need to be, at least theoretically, supported with, would be something with, will be supported with something different, which is called metro, which would serve different tasks and different styles of destinations, and presumably much more in the urban core. And I agree with what you're saying. I think that narrative, or that policy development process that we needed to go through, I think it got lost because the Network Development Plan and messaging out of state governments and other people simply kind of fudged that issue and labelled everything as being metro. Now, for argument's sake, I think some ideas that were partly there in the Network Development Plan, but also partly not fully developed, surround the difference between Australian-style suburban rail versus metro, and why they are different, why they should be kept different. So one of the main items I would suggest would be, with these longer distance journeys that you're servicing, that you need more express running patterns. So that you would be picking people up on the outskirts, stopping all stations for 5 or 6 stations in a row when you're out in the outskirts of Melbourne or Sydney. And there's a certain amount of this in Sydney, of course. But then onbound, through the middle suburbs and into the urban core, you might be only stopping every 5 or 6 stations. Now, that's on the one hand, that would be a fantastic outcome, and we do see it in certain areas. I think that's where the future is for Australian rail, and it's a very challenging future. It involves passing opportunities at certain locations. It involves high-tech, modern standard signalling systems to bring about that outcome. But the standard of service would be absolutely matched to what passengers need, Australian passengers need. And yet I haven't seen anywhere that type of discussion unfolding, although, again, it was kind of hinted at a little bit in the Network Development Plan, for argument's sake. So, again, I think it's very, very important that we carefully distinguish between different forms of rail and the Australian suburban landscape, which is much broader distance, much larger geographically speaking, etc., and how we might need to develop our own version of Australian suburban rail with express running and so on, and systems-related expressions of that, and also service-related philosophy, but also distinguishing that between new offerings that are more world-style, metro-style, MRT-style offerings that, again, service different types of trip purposes in different geographic locations. Again, that's the discussion that I would like to be having, but I haven't heard much of that from the industry or from state governments and so on in recent times.
Yeah, a couple of comments there. One is the long distances. That's exactly what I'm observing as well. So if I look at Sydney Metro, for example, they have the first line, which is Metro Northwest. Now they're extending it from Chatswood into the city, and they call it Metro City, which is just an extension of the existing line. So just the Northwest line becomes longer and just goes into the city. And then after that, it will become yet longer, going to the Southwest, all the way out to Bankstown. And once it's going out to Bankstown, it will be the longest CBTC fitted railway line in the world. So that kind of proves your point that there is still this mindset of having very long railway lines, but calling it metro because it's using metro style technology. And that may cause some problems in itself. The other thing is with regards to express services, I'm not a fan of express services at all, unless, and you did mention that, you have opportunities for express trains to overtake all stoppers. If you don't have that, and the problem is that in many settings in Australia, you don't have that. You just have a double track railway where one direction is served by a single track. And when you try to run express trains and all stoppers on that track, you ending up with great problems that inhibits higher capacity. And you can see it in Melbourne on the Dandenong corridor, where you do have express services by means of V-line trains, the regional trains going into the city center. And when they are trapped behind all stoppers, they slow down to the same slow pace that the all stoppers have, because there are simply no opportunities to overtake. Yeah. So therefore, I'm rather careful, or I'm rather advising against express services if a railway wants to increase capacity and come to a timetable with shorter slots between trains.
Yeah, so I guess the proviso would be that no move in the direction of increased express service offering, unless some very specific changes are made and some very specific investments, including. But the interesting thing, I think, and the reason we should be talking about this particular topic more than we have been, is I believe firstly that that a lot of those specific investments to facilitate better express running could actually be quite targeted. So you find that in a sense the weak points of the network. So I don't necessarily think you have to go to quadruple tracking the whole way through the length of any given line. You do it mainly in specific locations, and probably the closer you get into the city, the more you revert to sort of quadruple tracking. But further out in the suburbs, it's probably again about specific passing opportunities, which basically means infrastructure investments to achieve that outcome. And it involves signalling upgrades, major signalling upgrades. And it also requires a change in service philosophy, a fairly sophisticated service philosophy. But firstly, by doing that, I think we'd be servicing effectively the trip styles that are relevant to large geographic areas in Australian cities. So that'd be a good it'd be an excellent service-based outcome. Secondly, again, I'd say that there's possibly an investment program that maximises those opportunities without overdoing the cost. I know it would be expensive, but it doesn't have to be a complete transformation of absolutely everything. I believe it could be achieved with targeted investment. And thirdly, I would believe that style of investment might actually be the best benefit cost return profile rail investment opportunity type that we have in Australia at the moment. So much more cost effective than, for argument's sake, building a brand new tunnelled metro line. That's obviously very, very high cost, very, very high risk, fantastic outcomes, therefore great benefits, but an inherently sort of risky style of project that we need plenty of in Australia. But I don't think actually compares very well to targeted investments, strategic investments, again, to get much, much better out of the existing network that we have. So I think they're fantastic investment opportunities, investment profiles from certain styles of project that would facilitate better express running and clear up some of those blockages that you were alluding to. But again, these are not discussions that we're used to having in Australian rail or Australian, even in city planning. For example, people living at Frankston's a great place to live out there in the southeast of Melbourne. It's fantastic. You couldn't ask for a better place to live on a world scale with beaches, everything that you could want, affordable housing, etc. But its problem has always been that it's an hour and 10 minutes on rail into the Melbourne Central Business District. And if you can improve that by 15 minutes, that's a great getting into other policy discussions that we're having in Australia. It begins helping us to address coherently the housing affordability issue. If all of a sudden much greater numbers of people see it viable to live in southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, like Frankston, or in the far east of Melbourne, or in the far north, or in relevant parts of Sydney and Brisbane, that's something that's not just the rail story. It's also a housing affordability outcome that we could achieve. And I believe it's probably something like express style service investments that unlock that style of opportunity on the metropolitan scale. And I think there's equivalent story that we haven't been speaking about, again, basically about housing affordability, that's about regional rail. You know, for me, I've been very frustrated for the last 2 years or whatever to hear stories about a housing crisis, et cetera, and consistently to not see regional rail investment as the central element of a solution. And not everyone wants to live in the suburbs or in the city. You know, a lot of people, very, very, particularly now with remote working, very, very happy to live in a regional centre like Bendigo, Ballarat, etc., different parts of New South Wales that might be, you know, feasibly close to being sort of an hour. You know, maybe they don't need to come into the central business district every day. It might be once every week or a couple of times a fortnight or something like that. Similar opportunities up there in southeast Queensland. And so regional rail to me is absolutely central to housing affordability and general planning debates in Australia, but we haven't been connecting the two topics together. And weirdly enough, I guess what I'm saying is that's also a question of things like service patterns and therefore particular infrastructure investment opportunities that are out there at the moment that I think are being overlooked to some degree.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of what I call regional fast rail, which is improved connections. I mean, you do have regional services everywhere today. So for Melbourne, for example, there is a train to Geelong, there's a train to Ballarat, there's a train to Bendigo, there's a train to Traralgon, but it's taking forever. So the key there would be to create a service which is just faster. And in the case of Melbourne, I thought Geelong Fast Rail was going to do exactly that, or at least aiming at exactly that. But now it's on hold. So the question is how important is regional fast rail? And I've done previous presentations where I basically showed three main pillars for rail transport in Australia. One being everything that's happening in cities, which is metros or suburban rail. And you could probably differentiate between those two as well if you wanted to open up another category. Then you've got regional fast rail between cities and regional centers around it. So in the case of Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong, places like this. For Melbourne, we named them already. For Brisbane would be Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast. And then you've got the white elephant, which is high-speed rail, which really goes city to city to city, where I still don't think we've got a decent business case in Australia, but that's a different story. So, but for regional fast rail, that's a concept that works quite well in other cities. You could argue that even the S-Bahn systems that you mentioned from Germany have some similarities with such a regional service where in the case of Berlin, for example, the S-Bahn lines go quite a bit out of the city center and improve the transport of people coming in. I'm still not a fan, and I guess we probably don't come to agreement there. I'm still not a fan of express services for suburban rail because you mentioned the quality of life in places like Frankston, for example. So plus you've got more affordable housing. So if people have all the benefits of a place like this, then the price they have to pay is a longer commute. And I think it's only fair. There are people who want to live on the beach with a shorter commute, and then they live in places like Brighton, and the price tag is very, very, very different from what it is in Frankston. But somebody going out to Frankston for the lower cost and the higher quality of living, and then expecting to have commuting times as short as someone who lives in Brighton or Sandringham, I just don't think it's realistic. I just don't think it's fair. And I think that the transport system shouldn't accommodate something like this. But in fairness for everybody, distances closer to the city should naturally have a shorter commute and not the other way around, because we have express services from the outer suburbs and then the inner suburbs are left with all the disbenefits like higher housing costs and more congestion, plus even longer commutes by rail. I don't consider this fair.
Yeah, although I think there's also it's not purely, I don't think, an issue of travel speed. I think there are reasons why, capacity-related reasons why we have to look at express running. And to me, it's fairly basic in the sense that if you're living in that Frankston area, for argument's sake, or if you're living in the north of Melbourne in that growth corridor, the recent extension out to Mernda in the north, and there's also other potential rail extensions that are up there quite some distance away from the Melbourne Central Business District, and maybe if there's equivalent locations out in the west of Melbourne. The reality is by the time you begin a run at Frankston and you go through Bond Beach, Carrum, etc., after about 5 or 6 stations in the morning run, you've basically got a full train anyway. And so there's in some regards, there's simply no utility to having a full train stopping at every single station. I know there's a certain amount of express pattern, but to have these trains stopping beyond that point at every single station, where historically we've already had literally the scenario that people can't physically get on the train, and so you're kind of wasting. You're not servicing. Firstly, you're not servicing the line end passengers with the style of service that they need. Secondly, there's a physical capacity related constraint that is simply not practical to stop full vehicles all the way through. And thirdly, put it this way. So I think one of the reasons for not looking at those sorts of opportunities has been that they're not simply straightforward to solve. I'm not talking about an easy solution or something that's very simple and straightforward where you just make a couple of quick tweaks and change the timetable a little bit and then you magically get a faster ride and you solve all of the capacity issues. These would be quite serious planning studies, strategic studies and investment programs that we'd need to undertake. But again, I don't think it's purely about speed. It's also about the capacity related issues and similar things in outer Sydney and so on. But by the time you've made the train full after 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 stops, it's just quite questionable whether it actually makes sense to continue stopping the train.
Yeah. Well, if a train is already full when it reaches the inner suburbs, then to me that sounds like a railway line that's underserviced. Yeah, so
that's right. So I think there's a flip side to what I've just said about the outer suburbs, which is that I think the middle and inner suburbs need their own. And again, the network development plan, the PTV network development plan from 10 or 11 years ago actually spoke to these sorts of issues. It didn't. I don't think it fully developed them quite to the extent that maybe I would have liked to have seen. But I think there might have been additional strategic iterations of work that could have been done to continue teasing things out. But they correctly identified that there probably needs to be a version of segmentation in Melbourne, which says that the inner and middle suburbs get their own more stopping all stations, more metro-style service patterns. But for the literal reason that they're people who, as you said, they paid all the money to live in the inner suburbs and whatever. But they can't get on the train in the morning because they're already full. But by the time the trains get to their suburb or to their station, and secondly, strangely enough, also because of the nature of express running and so on, and a whole bunch of other issues, you can actually see relatively inner city or middle suburbs train passengers in Australian cities where their commute times are almost as long as some outer suburban commuters are travelling, again because of the patterns of service and so on. So I think it's an interesting mix of different issues. But if you're really asking me, I would say, well, we also need to think about segmenting, to use that word, the inner and middle suburbs to get service patterns that respond and capacity delivery that responds to the needs of those parts of the network as well. And again, I do believe it was kind of laid out as an issue in a document like the 2012 Network Development Plan, but we haven't seen subsequent, I wouldn't say strategic development, there certainly haven't even been strategic discussions of that type or policy discussions of why these sorts of issues are really, really absolutely central in not just in transport terms or in rail terms, but in housing patterns and And also, when we talk about things, if people who are not rail specialists, so I don't know if people are tuning in for this podcast if they're not rail specialists, but just say there are people who are from more of a planning background. And I've always been surprised, someone who's got a sort of a land use bag. I originally started out in the property sector myself and dealing with land use planning and property development and so on. And matching that knowledge base with what I know about rail and service patterns, it's not actually the case, as the Australian mainstream planning community likes to depict it, that every single station in the rail network is equally appropriate for high density styles of development or planning. There are certain strategic locations in certain parts of the network in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne that are much more amenable for high intensity housing style development or other forms of real estate development, whereas even a station that might be one stop or two stops closer to the central business district, for reasons related to service patterns, etc., and capacity issues and so on, might actually be inherently problematic for high density real estate development. And so as much as I've been frustrated over the last decade or so about lack of progress in the strategic narrative and the level of insight that we bring to our policy and strategic discussions on rail, I also think that we've not matched an insightful rail narrative and an insightful assessment of rail issues with a corollary in land use planning opportunity. And we need to really start bringing those two things together. We need to understand why certain locations, let's call it Caulfield, for example, in the Melbourne context, or Footscray on the other side of the city, and certain other locations, why those are super locations to be looking from a land use intensification perspective. And because of their rail-related attributes, their rail network attributes, whereas, again, other stations are not as good. We just haven't had this type of discussion in the Australian context. And I can guarantee people who might be listening, it's not the case that all transit-oriented development opportunity sites are created equal. They are not. It really is based on, again, on the strategic attributes and strategic positioning within the overall rail network. Or it might be related to where the investments are happening. And what style of investments are coming through. So if you use the example of the Dandenong-Pakenham corridor and project about 10 minutes ago, and it might have been that there were some really good land use related opportunities that might have emerged or could have emerged from that particular rail investment program, but we didn't see any flip side of that in a land use planning strategic approach.
I believe the whole thing of precinct planning, to me, seems relatively new in Australia, relatively recent, especially in relation with railway planning. So in Melbourne, I think the first time I've really seen this quite intensely was for the Metro Tunnel project, where they said, okay, well, what do we do around the Arden precinct, which was just an industrial, not to say wasteland, that wouldn't be fair to the people that had their businesses there, but there wasn't much going on in Arden, and now there's a lot of development going on, Parkland, similar thing. And you can also see it in Melbourne very clearly with the suburban rail loop, which puts a lot of emphasis on the vicinity of the stations and the precinct development around it. In Sydney, similar thing. Sydney Metro has put a lot more emphasis on this whole station precinct concept, where the stations are to become the centerpiece of a wider town planning, city planning, suburban planning, whatever you want. And in Perth, there have been only a couple of examples I can think of. There was a transport-oriented development pretty close where I live in Wellard, and which I think at the time was the first TOD that we had in Australia, I believe. So I could imagine that this is something where a lot of influx from overseas comes in, where people planning a metro here in Australia, they look at what's happening in Hong Kong, for example, where the development of the station precincts actually finances the entire railway operation. Yeah. And so I think there were a few aha moments, I guess. and now we see a lot more of this precinct planning coming into Australia and getting a stronger foothold. Is that kind of what you would see as well?
Yeah, I think firstly, you're absolutely correct that Sydney has a much longer history of rail-associated development. So you've had for many, many years success stories in places like Chatswood in Sydney, St Leonard's, Parramatta, just miles and miles and decades ahead in terms of intensification and so on in an appropriate location, decades ahead of anything that we've seen in Melbourne. So Melbourne has been much slower to, I think that in Sydney, that's probably related to, historically speaking, the complicated geography of Sydney. So you get more pockets in Sydney where there's geographic constraints, there's bays and so on, there's mountains towards the inland, and there's a lot more hills and so on in Sydney. So you get specific locations where it's feasible to do higher density development, and that you simply had more rail patronage in Sydney, historically speaking, than you've had in Melbourne. And Melbourne, no one likes to air this topic, and it's a great big secret, but there's much more public transport mode share in Sydney than there is in Melbourne. Melbourne is much more like a Los Angeles in many parts, in the eastern suburbs and the southeastern suburbs, in terms of things like mode share and so on. It's admittedly a much larger legacy rail network than a city like Los Angeles, but Sydney has always been ahead on rail usage and public transport usage, and they have a greater history of integrated TOD style planning, and they've got more success stories there in Sydney. Melbourne, again, very, very late into this style of planning, and historically, what a lot of people point to in Melbourne, and one of the key differences between Sydney is, in Sydney, your what do you call it, shopping centre owners, and people who are investing in big box shopping centres in the 1980s and so on, they almost always chose rail associated locations for those big box shopping investments in Sydney. Whereas in Melbourne, it's almost like the developers deliberately, in some regard, probably did deliberately put their facilities simply elsewhere, away from the rail network. I don't really know the history of why it was that it seemed, but it really does seem like that's what's gone on in Sydney during the 1970s and the 1980s. And so that's very, very different. And you've got emerging locations like Box Hill, which I think is a version of transit-oriented development, and you've got other opportunity locations like Footscray that can still emerge. Dandenong, I think, struggles a little bit because of its, again, the travel time issue with Dandenong is a bit of a constraint, but I think there are opportunities in locations like Dandenong. But historically speaking, we just haven't had the headway with that style of planning, that style of development here in Greater Melbourne that they've had up there in Sydney. I think maybe there's also another issue with the history of local governments in Sydney. They used to have a larger number of smaller local governments in Sydney. And so I think each of those relatively small local governments grabbed hold of the best opportunity site that they had within their small local government area and developed it. And so historically, Burwood was its own local government, and therefore you get a TOD style outcome in Burwood. The list goes on. Again, Chatswood, St Leonard's, etc. These were all originally small local governments who had one particular location that they felt they could develop, and it was around their best rail station. Whereas the local governments tended to be a little bit larger in the Greater Melbourne context, and for some reason a little bit more sceptical about rail. And so we just haven't had that history. Now, Brisbane, you mentioned Perth, but Brisbane, I can tell you, as someone who's investigated transit-oriented planning and policy and so on in Brisbane, Brisbane has seen the least headway of all of these cities in terms of transit-oriented development. I think there was a period there, in 2003 or 4 or 5, they introduced the so-called regional plan there in southeast Queensland, which was all about transit-oriented planning according to the text of the plan. And I think there was one stage about 12 years after that plan that I calculated that they'd not delivered a single individual housing unit in a transit-oriented format in the whole of southeast Queensland since the regional plan spoke about transit-oriented planning and transit-oriented development. So yeah, a mix of different things. I just go, the only other interesting thing is I go back to somewhere like Arden, and I don't know how you feel about this, but I just put it to you, I think they've overcooked a site like Arden. So it's great. Density is a great thing. And there's every reason to carefully, strategically choose locations where you have higher density, and presumably you taper your density so that it's more higher density within 200 meters of the station area and so on, then you taper and taper. But to me, I think you would, speaking of Hong Kong, I think you would struggle to find a Hong Kong example that's matching to the density of the Arden real estate project. They're really pumping some very, very high towers over multiple blocks. Again, in Hong Kong is a very dense city, let's face it, but again, there tends to be a clustering, a focusing density in a location like Hong Kong, and much more so in somewhere like Singapore. Concentration of density in the right location, and then trying to balance different housing formats in the broader precinct. Arden, to me, looks like a bunch of planners very committed to the idea of high density, but struggling to balance things like public open space, struggling to balance the tapering issue in terms of density, struggling to balance the idea of different housing formats, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to be careful when we do transit-oriented development that it isn't simply, focusing all of our density into one specific location. You need to really look at it on a network scale. And again, I think these are the issues of immaturity and planning immaturity in the Australian context.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I haven't been to Arden for a long time, so I don't really know firsthand what's going on there, and especially with things like public places and so on. What I was thinking about the whole time was a couple of stations on the airport line in Sydney, which I think were earmarked for high density development when they built the airport line. And that's Green Square and Mascot, which are the two stations between Sydney Airport and the Sydney CBD. And I spent a lot of time in Mascot because whenever I was in Sydney, that was a convenient place for me to stay in a relative inexpensive hotel compared to the city center, but still had a train ride of like only 5 minutes to get into Central. And I actually quite like it. I mean, there was obviously that building scandal, but that's a different thing. I mean, if you need to build proper houses, that's a given in my view anyway. But other than that, from the structure of a place like Mascot, the quality of the housing, also the quality of the people living there, I think that's been quite successful. So if Arden takes something like this as a template or as a model, I'm reasonably optimistic that the outcome will be quite nice. Yeah, and to your term of overcooking the location. The thing is, from a city planning perspective, you basically have one shot. If you develop an area like Arden, you can't just come back in 10 years and say, we need another 5 stories on that skyscraper. That's not going to happen. Yeah. So they need to think about how many people do we want there. And then it's now. The time to develop is now. And and I'm guessing there probably is some rationale behind it, where they had a very clear idea how much population they wanted to accumulate in Arden, and then they will build accordingly. Yeah, and depending on the quality of the place, I mean, we will see probably what the uptake will be, and it may not be a place where you would want to live or where I would want to live. I wouldn't want to live in Mascot either, because that's not suitable to my long-term living style with dogs and what have you. But for visiting or with a certain lifestyle, like as a younger couple, both are going to work, that's a fantastic place to live. Yeah, very, very close to the city, very good amenities, public places that are quite pleasant, like little parks and something like that. So if I didn't have my family, that would be a perfect place to live in Sydney. Yeah. So and I guess a similar thing will be in Arden, that it just attracts a certain clientele, hopefully a high quality one, and then it has all the chances to develop into a good area. For example, in Melbourne, I quite like Docklands. Yeah, I know a lot of people don't like Docklands, but I quite like it. I think it's a nice combination of high density housing and nice public places like around the basin and stuff like that. So yeah, tastes are different, and I still think that something like Arden could be a success.
My belief is that I think there's a couple of problems I have with Arden. So I'll just, for the risk, for the purpose of being brief, I'll just list them out. I think firstly, when you look at the actual plans, they're much higher density than on a much broader multi-block scale than people. If you have to really go back and look at the plans, and I've been, I have to say, a little bit surprised or even shocked at how dense it is that they're talking about. Secondly, when you there's ups and downs with density. One of the problems can be if you go too dense, you have delivery problems. Higher density basically equals higher risk in terms of construction finance and delivery and so on in the Australian context. And so when you get multiple blocks of very high density, one of the possible risks there is it sits there largely undeveloped for 10 or 15 years. And so it's theoretical housing supply and housing capacity that hasn't actually been delivered. And so that's why I think you have to balance density related issues sometimes. Thirdly, I think there's simply not enough public open space there. And fourthly, kind of related to that, I think there are some known flooding issues. I know it's not the most attractive area down there along the creek, but there's some known flooding issues where it would seem to be that the perfect opportunity for public open space and flood mitigation. I've looked at the plans again and again and again. They seem to be encroaching on the flood zone. From what I've seen, I don't really understand why that is, other than they're super keen to get fantastic density out of the situation. And then finally, I'd say if it's really a transit-oriented development, then that means the relationship to the upfield rail line, which is over at the Flemington Bridge Station, which is that they didn't resolve that integration between the two different lines. So there was a rail integration opportunity that wasn't taken up, and there was an integration opportunity to the trams as well that I don't believe was taken up. And so therefore, what I'm saying is that we, in Melbourne in particular, but Australia in general, we should, as you said, we should learn from what they've done in Singapore. But what they've done in Singapore is, amongst other things, is they've integrated different forms of public transport. That's one thing they've absolutely certainly done. And I know it's like people say, oh, it's just buses and whatever. But if you go to those projects in Singapore, they made a huge effort to integrate a localised bus feeder style and coverage network that's functional and effective. And they've integrated that with the rail offering. And they've made that a cornerstone of what they're doing in their version of transit-oriented development. They've also done phasing in Singapore. So they parcel up different sub-precincts and so on. And this is what we're doing now. And maybe the station bit on top of the station is happening now. But there'll be phase 2 and phase 3 and phase 4. And we'll make those decisions in due course and so on. So I think there's a level of sophistication. And again, the opportunity for us to take a more sophisticated view of the different ways that different international exemplars are approaching things like transit-oriented development and the relationship between property, funding, etc., and rail investment on the other. I think we have, again, I'm just surprised how little discussion of these topics we've had in the Australian context since I've been involved in this thing. And I don't think land use planning sector in Australia is still speaking to the same talking points, as far as I've heard, that they were speaking to like 15 years ago. And they haven't really gotten it yet, this idea of integration between different modes. They haven't really understood this idea of certain locations for rail-related strategic reasons, and maybe less so in other locations. I don't think they've understood that. I don't think there's been a real balance between density on the one hand, recognising the risks of density also in terms of those delivery horizons, but also balancing with public open space. And I agree that some of those examples in Sydney are really good. I like Mascot. I think Green Square has been good. I think there's been a reasonably good relationship of those projects to the rail investment initiatives originally themselves. But it's really, I think, it's really time for us to take stock in Australia now and, improve the sophistication and quality of our policy and strategy discussion. And amongst other things, it's been an interesting chat to have with you today. But I think, sorry, land use planners, but one thing I would argue for is that land use planners need to give greater credence and greater attention space to the strategic rail issues and the rail investment program issues that relate to a land use side and a housing equation. I just haven't seen that it's great to talk about housing and it's great to talk about housing affordability and so on, but can we please talk about the regional rail and the suburban rail and the rail investment related and systems related dimension of those topics and see that they do go together, they must go together, they should go together. Places like Singapore have gotten that balance correct. I think also you could say, again, like continental Europe, Germany, different settlement patterns and whatever, but they get the mix. They certainly get the rail and the integrated public transport right when they're doing their regional and city planning and their housing planning. And it's a very German style, particular style of housing, particular style of planning, particular style of projects, etc. But they've basically gotten that right. Whereas we have it all ahead of us in Australia to reintegrate these various different issues.
Maybe as a final word, because I'm conscious of our time, how do you have indicated what would be a good thing to have in Australia at this point in time in transport planning? Short summary or a couple of points from your point of view, how can that be achieved? What would you like to see from your transport planning perspective? You can pick a place, you can pick Melbourne, you can pick Sydney, whatever you like. What would you see needs to happen in a concrete way? Not just, land planning needs to recognize the railway specific problems, but how can we bring this together? And where would you like to have your role, your involvement in this?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One would be we need to shift from a focus on individual flagship rail projects, individual projects that are great projects like the suburban rail loop, etc., the metro projects in Sydney. Those are great, and to some degree the airport rail links that we need to keep moving, and etc., etc. The sort of Olympics-related projects up there in Brisbane. But we need to move away from, again, individual projects basis to seeing all of those as programs. The South East Queensland Rail Program, which includes an investment sensibility. This Greater Sydney Rail Program and the New South Wales Regional Rail Program, the Melbourne Rail Program. And when we say programs, it absolutely will mean, and this is the shock for people, it will mean constantly maintaining concurrent rail investments and rail projects in different parts of the city, again, concurrently. So not this, we're going to do this project, and then when we finish that project, then we'll look at, I don't know, I mean, I scratch my head a little bit now, putting aside the level crossings projects, with the metro tunnel here in Melbourne, reaching its absolute final phases, and they're doing almost testing and so on. I mean, do we actually have a rail project underway in Melbourne at this point in time? It's an interesting question. And we don't have time to bring the airport rail link project forward, but do we actually have a genuine rail project underway at this time in Melbourne? Because they all seem to either be concluding or they're in limbo. So that's the challenge. That's where we need to go. We need to balance. We know what the projects are. We know it's about $100 billion that we need in across Greater Melbourne and Victoria for all those different projects. But how do we make that happen in 15 years and stop pushing it out into the never? Being able to do work in the north of Melbourne, in the west of Melbourne, in the east and the southeast, and in the urban core, consistently and concurrently with sophisticated funding approaches that delivers to the industry the certainty and predictability that they need to have their crews and their capacity related situation sorted out. So that's the first thing that we need. And again, we need to talk about that more often. The other thing that I just mentioned in brief, in passing almost, but I think it's crucially important. I know it's not a topic really for today when people think about rail, but the bus network. And so we need to see the rail offering as the strategic skeleton, so to speak, of our metropolitan areas, but we need the fabric of public transport movement, and really getting people in and out of railway stations needs to be carried much better by a much more up-to-date bus offering. And so really funneling people into rail and getting them to and from those railway stations. I saw some figures recently that said something like, basically everyone that uses rail in Melbourne lives within walking distance of the railway station. That kind of, in some regards, it sounds obvious, but some other statistics I've seen that suggest in other countries, most people take the bus or some other form of public transport to get to rail, and most of them don't live within walking distance of an actual railway station. Therefore, they're reliant on buses and other forms of public transport. So that integrated public transport network model needs to be something that we move towards, and is paradoxical as it might sound, to really improve our rail network and get more people on rail and so on. As much as anything, we need to be doing interesting things with buses.
Yeah, and we don't even have to look overseas all the time. I think here in Perth we have some very smart integrated transport plans, and the transition from buses to trains in particular, I think, is resolved very, very well here in many places, and all the new places that are being built have this bus interchange concept woven into it right from the get-go. Other than that, a pipeline of projects is certainly important, and what I'm a strong proponent of is to improve the performance of the existing rail network rather than keep building new civil infrastructure. And again, in Melbourne, that runs under the label of high-capacity signaling. But given how important this is for the future of public transport in the city, the progress there is way too slow in my books, and there's a great risk that it will come much too late to really move the needle. So that's definitely something where investment, where you would get a lot more bang for the buck compared to civil infrastructure projects. But it's important for politicians to recognize this, that it's not always the big station opening with cutting a ribbon that's the most important thing, but sometimes it's really technology which gives much more leverage to the future of public transport. So being conscious of the time, Chris, I enjoyed this conversation very, very much, and I hope we can maybe have a continuation of this in the future. I'm sure there are many topics that we couldn't touch in this short period of time. So thanks very much for making the time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
My usual rant to all the listeners at the end of this: if you enjoyed this episode, then check out some of the others, and importantly, tell your friends about it, because I believe it's a great podcast where a lot of work goes in. I have very, very good guests, as I had today, that put a lot of effort in to inform and entertain you. And with that said, until next time, keep it simple, and bye for now. Hi, this is Dr. Frank from the studio. I want to inform you about my latest and greatest training development, and it is all about the mindset of a high-capacity railway organization. What I found in my experience of training and consulting is that often you have projects for new technology which seem to be perfectly planned, which are very well executed, and they still don't lead to the success that was expected. And very often the reason for that is mindset. Key stakeholders that have what I call a legacy mindset, an outdated old ways of thinking, where the new technology is treated in the same way as the old one, but it's just not suitable to get the most out of the new technology. What I'm offering in this training course, which is called High Capacity Railway Mindset, is that every month there's a new training module with 5 examples of an outdated legacy mindset, the suggestion of a new mindset more suitable for a high capacity railway, and how to get from the old to the new
mindset. So those modules will be repeated every month for an entire year. So in total, we are talking about 60 different examples how to get from an old mindset to a more suitable new mindset. And the cost for this is only $10 per example. So this can be paid monthly, this can be paid for a year. And then you have the usual service of an alumni community afterwards where you can ask ongoing questions for at least 12 months after the training. You find more information and you can sign up on my training portal, docfranktraining.podia.com/mindset. I hope I see you at this training. It's really leading edge stuff. Nobody else in the world is training on this. And if you really want to explore the ultimate frontier of success in technology projects, then this is the training you need to take. Hi, it's Dr. Frank again. I hope you liked today's episode. I like to keep it as simple as possible, so I only have one single request for you. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends and colleagues about it. That's all I want, because that's a service that I'm providing to the industry. And I would like as many people as possible to listen to this podcast and learn something from it. So please share. And until next time, keep it simple and bye for now. Thank you for listening.